Thank you, Cal and Deborah, for your kind introduction and for inviting me a few months ago to come and not only to join the Holy Ground volunteer team, but also to speak this evening. At a recent Holy Ground planning meeting, there was a phrase used on a number of occasions which reflected the desire to have speakers who were well-known names. So tonight you've got me. Thought I'd just get the disappointment in first, really. So as somebody who you've probably never heard of, I've been in the Diocese of Exeter for about 35 years, and as Deborah mentioned, I've been a lay licensed minister for about 20 of those. I'm married to Reverend Jane Frost, who sat just there, who some of you will know, and as Deborah said, we moved house just last week to rejoin the Totnes team where Deborah is also ministering. So we're delighted about doing that. The move itself, well, we'll work through that one eventually. As Deborah also mentioned, professionally, my working career was helping people to find or remain in employment. And I specialised in helping those for whom mental ill health affected their ability to stay in work. And I was honoured to be appointed an MBE for that. Jane reminded me the other day that the coming week is not only Christian Aid Week, but it is Mental Health Awareness Week. So it's perhaps a timely coincidence that I should be asked to talk this evening. Now, I'm audio recording the talk, and it'll be on my blog at Work.Rest.Pray in the next couple of days if you wanted to listen again to it, or simply wanted to practice using your fast forward button. Just stick that up there. We live in a world where people are desperate to feel loved. A world which is dominated by the number of likes that you have on Instagram or TikTok or views on YouTube. A world where the greatest insult you can pay somebody is to unfriend them on Facebook. A world where celebrities can get their novel published without receiving any rejections. I'm not referring to Tom Hanks there, by the way. To authors who can't get contracts if they don't have thousands of followers on Twitter. I'm just saying. We live in a world of self-promotion. So as someone who's had books rejected and doesn't have thousands of followers on Twitter, here's a blatant piece of self-promotion. It can come up. There we are. So I'm the published author of 4 books. Life with St. Benedict reflects that I'm an oblate, as Deborah mentioned, a lay member of a Benedictine monastic community. A Story to Tell reflects on what we can learn from some of the people who met Jesus. So a lot of the time we focus on what we can learn from Jesus, but think about all those people who met him, what we could learn from all of those. Finding stability in times of change takes the miracle of the calming of the storm and how that relates to what we experience in our day-to-day lives and how we cope with the storms of life, like moving house. And I'm also the author of a novella, Looking to Move On. Not dissimilar issues in some respects about how hope overcomes adversity. And I happen to have some copies with me. Specially reduced price for you. If you haven't got cash, I can give you back details. I love my wife, although being a man, I probably don't tell her as often as I should do. I love our lovely 2 children. I love my dog. And perhaps more remarkably, for the 1 or 2 of you who do know me, I do have love for myself. And with the theme of our evening being Love Yourself, and having spent all that time talking about myself, and all that I do and all that I've achieved, you may be thinking, oh, he's not going to go on about that all the time, is he? Well, I'm not, you'll be glad to hear. And it continually takes me by surprise that God, in his love and grace, has granted me so many wonderful privileges those aspects of life that I've mentioned, and those aspects of life which I will not. And those privileges, it has to be said, help give me a balanced view of myself, alongside all the mistakes, all the misjudgments, all the ways over the years how people didn't like what I said or did or wrote. All the pain and the hurt from the past are counterbalanced by those privileges and expressions of God's love and grace. And the same is true for each and every one of us gathered this evening and elsewhere. Our short reading reminded us of one of Jesus' most well-known sayings: "You shall love your neighbour as yourself." Now, probably most of us feel comfortable with the love your neighbour bit, thinking of others, being kind to people. Yeah, I can do that, that's fine, that bit's okay. But what about as yourself? To love ourselves in the same way as we love others. A bit more tricky, that one. Many of us focus on all the mistakes, all the misjudgments, all the ways people didn't like what we said or done, all the pain and the hurt. And yet, counterbalancing all that, there are good things in and about all of us. They may be hard to focus on at times, but they're there. The things we got right, the successes, they don't have to be showstoppers. The compliments we receive, even if we struggle to actually believe them. What we're good at, what we like about ourselves. So loving ourselves requires having a balanced view of who we are. And having a balanced view enables us to see what God, in his love and grace, has made good within us. For God's love for each of us isn't based on success and achievement. God doesn't love your vicar any more than you. That may go without saying, of course. You don't have to prove anything to God. God loves you no less than anyone else, complete with all the good bits and the bits that we don't like that much. So our love for both our neighbour and ourself has a common root. For that love, both for others and for ourselves, comes from God. God doesn't love us because we love him or we love her. Whether or not, or indeed whatever we think about God, God cares about and loves us regardless. And in order to love others and to love ourselves, I would suggest that we need to know above all that God loves each one of us beyond all words and all comparisons. Let's take for a moment the disciple John, one of the people who knew Jesus, one of the people that we can learn a lot from. He's commonly thought to be the one who was called the beloved disciple, the one whom Jesus loved. Now, so John knew that he was loved by another person, and he was secure in that love. He felt valued because of it. He knew he was loved because he was called by Jesus to follow him. He knew he was loved because he was listened to, even when he was wrong. He knew he was loved because he changed. He changed, like his brother, from an impetuous son of thunder to the disciple whom Jesus loved. He knew he was loved because he was allowed to be present at significant events. He knew he was loved because from the cross he was entrusted to care for Mary, the mother of Jesus. And they were all signs that John knew he was loved by another person. And because that other person was Jesus, John knew he was loved by God. But what was it like for John walking with the distressed and anxiety-ridden Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane? What was it like for him standing at the foot of the cross, helplessly watching the helpless Messiah who he loved and who loved him? What was it like being alongside Jesus' own mother and Mary Magdalene and others contagiously grieving their own sorrow and distress? Now, while it may have been the case during the preceding 3 years, and was definitely so later in John's life, at this precise moment, standing at the foot of the cross in the trauma and the pain, there's no room or energy or desire, to reflect on God loving him so much that he sent his son to die for him. And in the reality of our lives, in the storms, how in our experiences, being at the foot of the cross, how do we know that we are loved by God? Truly know, deep down inside, when life is tough and horrible. If only there was a simple answer, and there isn't. And maybe accepting that fact is helpful in itself. Now, in difficult times, in the storms of life, we can have those moments of knowing God's presence, of feeling that the storm is calmer, even if only for a moment. Times when God's love for us is tangibly demonstrated through answers to prayer, unexpected blessings, love from others. Again, so many ways, and how reassuring and comforting those expressions are. The lovely John Searle, who many of you, I'm sure, will have known, a true man of God, once said to Jane and I when we were going through a particular storm, he said, "Don't worry if you can't pray. That's what the church is for." And of course, in such times we can trip off familiar phrases, can't we? God is love. God so loved the world. God showed his love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Nothing can separate us from the love of God. There are so many affirmations of the truth and what reassuring and comforting words they are. And yet, how we understand and receive that love is limited by the words we use. Words place limits on love. God's love is far greater than any words. God's love for each one of us is beyond words. It is indescribable. Each of us is beloved by God in a way which is beyond words. Each of us is beloved by God in the same way John was. In a moment, we're going to pause for a few minutes. We're going to have a bit of silence and then some music from the choir. And I suggest that you just try and let that music just wash over you rather than simply listening to it. And as you do so, just spend some time reflecting on how you are being loved by God. Think about what it's like for you, not anyone else, what it's like for you to be loved by God. This is part of the reason why you were given a bit of paper and a pen or pencil. Just write some of those things down if you want to. Something that you can remember and look upon at a later time, at the times when perhaps you don't feel that God loves you. So as people who are loved by God, how does that help us to love ourselves? As mentioned earlier, we live in a society where people are desperate to be loved. I mean, there's many ways there's nothing wrong with that. We all want it to varying extents. We all want to feel loved in some way or other, to feel valued, to feel heard, to feel seen for who we actually are. Loving ourselves is influenced by those human needs, but is also different. Loving ourselves is the ability to look in the mirror and hold the person we see. To love ourselves as we actually are, without necessarily relying on external factors. To value ourselves, to see ourselves as we are, to love ourselves as we are, because God loves us. And loving ourselves doesn't mean that we have to be perfect. It doesn't mean getting everything right. If we believe we have to be perfect, then we diminish the need for God and we diminish the love of God in our lives. If we think we have to be perfect, then are we effectively saying to God, I don't need you? The love of God also means that God has realistic expectations of who we are. So loving ourselves means also that we are to have realistic expectations of ourselves. Now, we all live with many paradoxes, don't we? You know, all of us, or one of which is that none of us is as important as we like to think we are. Oh, I've got an MBE. I'm speaking at Exeter Cathedral. But also all of us, in God's love for us, are far more important than we think we are. Loving ourselves is being realistic about who we are and about not comparing ourselves to others. As one person put it, don't compare the inside of yourself with the outside of other people. It's that matter of balance. Loving ourselves is not about self-worship. It's not about putting ourselves first above absolutely everything and everybody else, but about putting sufficient self-care in place that we are then able to love our neighbour in a way that is beneficial for them and not diminishing to ourselves. It's about being kind to ourselves. It's about making time for ourselves. It's not about being selfish or about self-indulgence. It's about self-care, because if we don't love and care for ourselves, we won't be able to love and care for our neighbours, for those people who we love and interact with. Over the years in my professional experience, and in church life and in personal relationships, I've seen far too many people working so hard to prove themselves to themselves, let alone other people. They become unable to love others, and they become unable to love themselves. They've put everything into everything, only to be left with nothing for anything. Loving ourselves can also be about the narrative we give ourselves, to change the story we tell ourselves. Now, many of us live in the shadows of or with the impact of events, actions and words of the past and the present, be they our own or those of others. Many of us live with illness, or in particular family situations, often very painful things that have pushed aside the love we might have for ourselves. Many people identify themselves according to their illness or their situation. They've lost the sense of who they are because of those things. They've lost their sense of identity. Many of us have that inner voice that torments. Oh, I'm a horrible person. I'm a failure. I always get it wrong. We can't change the events and the words of the past, but we can change our response to them. And loving ourselves sometimes involves changing the narrative. Now, of course, that takes time and effort, as most loving does. If we've been living with the same narrative for years, it will take a long time to rewrite it, and we may need help in doing so. And seeking help when we need it is itself all part of loving oneself too. Seeking help is a sign of strength, not a sign of failure, as many people believe it to be. Loving ourselves is about nurturing the plant which is you, of acknowledging that which is difficult, of acknowledging those things we don't like about ourselves, of putting aside some of the pain, of weeping over it, but using that lament to enable growth to take place. Growth that is rooted in the love that God has for you. Jesus said, "I have come that you may have life in all its fullness." It's all right to love, to feel good about yourself. It's not about being selfish or self-indulgent. You know where to draw the lines in those things. It's all right to love yourself. Earlier, the choir sang those words of the beautiful Psalm 139. And in a moment, we'll sing Bernadette Farrell's lovely song based upon that same psalm. But before then, another bit of quiet. You might like to reflect again, to write down anything you feel God has been saying to you this evening through the words, the music, the silence. A piece of paper you can take away with you, perhaps to reread or add to at a later point.